The day my uncle looked me in the eye across that boardroom table and told me I was no longer needed at Callaway Timber, I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I just stared at the coffee ring stain on the mahogany surface and thought about how my grandfather had bought that table at an auction in Sudbury back in 1987, and how he'd always said it was the ugliest piece of furniture he'd ever owned, but it made him feel serious when he sat behind it. That was the last thought I had before the security guard. A guy named Terry, who used to sneak me extra sandwiches from the break room when I was a kid, placed his hand on my shoulder and walked me to the elevator. I was 31 years old. I had $340 in my checking account, a '09 Civic with a cracked windshield, and nowhere to go. Let me back up. My grandfather, Walter Callaway, built Callaway Timber from nothing. He started with a second-hand chainsaw and a lease on 40 acres of crown land near Parry Sound, Ontario. By the time I was born, the company had contracts with 3 provincial housing developers and employed over 60 people full-time. He was not a sentimental man. He didn't talk much, but he showed up every single morning at 6 a.m., even into his late 70s, and he never once asked anyone to do something he hadn't done himself. My father died when I was 9, black ice on Highway 400 in February, one of those accidents that doesn't make sense no matter how many times you replay it. After that, my grandfather became everything. I spent summers at his property outside Parry Sound, learning how to read grain in lumber, how to sharpen a blade properly, how to tell if a beam was load-bearing just by pressing your palm flat against it and feeling for give. When I turned 24, he brought me into the company. Started me at the bottom, the way he'd started himself. I drove the delivery truck for 2 years. Then I moved into procurement, then operations. By the time my grandfather had his first stroke, a minor one, the doctors said, though nothing about watching your grandfather forget your name feels minor. I was managing roughly a third of the company's supplier relationships. His second stroke, 2 years later, was not minor. He was moved into a care facility in Barrie. My aunt, his daughter, my father's sister, flew in from Calgary with her husband and her 2 adult sons, and suddenly the office that had always felt like it was built around my grandfather's absence felt very, very crowded. My aunt's name is Sylvia. She is a practical woman. She wears expensive blazers and talks about restructuring the way other people talk about the weather, casually, constantly, as if it's simply something that happens to you and there's no real use fighting it. Her older son, Brendan, had a business degree from Queen's and opinions about everything. Her younger son, Theo, mostly just agreed with whatever Brendan said. For 8 months, I tried. I really did. I kept my head down. I hit my numbers. I didn't say anything when Brendan started seeing himself onto my supplier emails without telling me. I didn't say anything when Sylvia restructured the operations division and my title quietly changed from operations manager to operations coordinator. I told myself it was temporary, that my grandfather would get better, that things would go back to the way they were. Then one morning in March, Sylvia called me into the boardroom, and there they all were, Brendan, Theo, and a lawyer I'd never met named Jeffrey something, and Sylvia folded her hands on top of my grandfather's ugly mahogany table and told me that in light of the company's new strategic direction, my position was being eliminated. What position? I said. You've been changing my title every 3 months. Which position exactly are you eliminating? She smiled the way people smile when they've already decided how a conversation is going to go. We're grateful for everything you've contributed, Liam. That was it. That was all she said, Liam. Like I was a contractor she was wrapping up a project with, not the person who had spent the last 7 years learning this company from the ground up because my grandfather had asked me to. Terry walked me to the elevator. I sat in my Civic in the parking lot for 22 minutes without starting the engine. I called my grandfather's care coordinator from the parking lot. He was having a good day, she said, which meant he recognized faces but not always names. I asked if I could visit that afternoon. When I walked into his room, he was sitting up in the chair by the window, looking out at the parking lot of the facility with the focused expression he used to get when he was watching a tree come down. tracking it, calculating where it was going to land. He looked at me for a long moment. "Tom's boy," he said. "Tom was my father." "Yeah," I said, "Tom's boy." He nodded slowly, like that settled something. Then he reached over to his bedside table and picked up an envelope that had been sitting there. And he held it out to me without any explanation, the way he used to hand me invoices to file when I was 12 years old, like I should already know what to do with it. My name was on the front in his handwriting, shaky now, but still his. Inside was a key, old brass and worn smooth, and a single index card. On the card, in the same shaky hand, the Kinsman Road property, the workshop behind the house. "You'll know what to look for." I hadn't thought about the Kinsman Road property in years. It was the original family land, 40 acres outside of Kearney, a 2-hour drive north, where my grandfather had grown up. There was a farmhouse on it that hadn't been lived in since the early 90s, and a workshop at the back of the property that my grandfather had used as a woodworking space before the business got too big and too demanding for hobbies. I had no idea the property was still in the family. I'd assumed it had been sold. I drove north that same evening. The highway out of Barry was clear, but the secondary road into Kearney was patchy with the last of the late March ice, and I had to slow the Civic down to a crawl for the last 20 minutes. When I finally turned onto Kinsman Road, the headlights swept across a property I barely recognized. The laneway was completely overgrown. The farmhouse was dark and listing slightly to one side, like it had grown tired of standing up straight. A spruce tree had come down at some point and taken part of the front porch railing with it. I sat in the car for a moment with the engine running and thought, very seriously, about turning around. Then I thought about Sylvia's smile, and Jeffrey the lawyer and Brendan seeing himself onto my emails. And I got out of the car. The farmhouse was in rough shape but structurally intact. I could tell that much from the outside. The foundation looked solid. The roof had lost shingles in patches but hadn't buckled. The windows were intact, which meant the interior had stayed mostly dry. These were not the observations of someone who knew what he was doing. I want to be clear about that. I'd spent 7 years in the timber business and I knew how to talk about lumber, but actually working with it, actually putting a building back together, that was different. But I had the key, and I had $340, and I had nowhere else to be. The workshop behind the farmhouse was smaller than I remembered. It was a solid post and beam structure, better built than the farmhouse in a lot of ways, because my grandfather had built it himself in the late 70s, and he had been meticulous about the things he built with his own hands. The key fit the padlock on the side door. Inside it smelled like cedar and oil, and the particular kind of cold that settles into an unheated space over many winters. I found his tools, all of them, as far as I could tell, hand planes, chisels, a bandsaw that looked like it had been serviced recently, or at least more recently than the decade of dust on everything else suggested. I found coffee cans full of salvaged screws sorted by size. I found stacks of lumber, some of it rough cut, some of it milled smooth, stored on proper racks off the ground, covered in tarps that had kept them mostly dry. What I did not find that first night was whatever my grandfather had meant by "you'll know what to look for." I slept in my car. I woke up at 5:30 because a pair of Canada geese were having an argument somewhere down near the tree line, and I couldn't sleep through it. And I lay there watching the sky go from gray to pale orange over the tree line, and thought about what kind of person I wanted to be when this, whatever this was over. I drove into Kearney that morning and got a coffee from the Tim Hortons on the main road and used the free Wi-Fi to start researching. Basic structural repair, foundation assessment, how to replace damaged shingles without creating new problems. I wasn't going to be able to hire anyone. I understood that, but I also understood lumber, its weight, its grain, how it moved in different conditions, better than most people who hadn't grown up in the industry, and that was something I could build on. I went back to the property, and I started with the porch. The fallen spruce had cracked 2 of the support posts and taken out a section of decking that was already rotted through. I cut the damaged posts free milled down 2 pieces from my grandfather's lumber stock to the right dimensions, and set them. It took me the better part of 2 days, and I had to drive back to Kearney 3 times for hardware. But when I was done, the porch was solid. More solid, probably, than it had been in 10 years. Something settled in me after that. Not happiness, exactly. More like direction. I knew what I was doing, even if I didn't know what I was doing, and that was enough to keep going. The weeks that followed were the hardest physical work I'd ever done in my life. I patched the roof section by section, working from a ladder I found rusting in the workshop, my hands raw by the end of each day because I kept forgetting to wear gloves. I pulled out the water-damaged drywall in the main bedroom and replaced it. I rehung 2 interior doors that had warped off their frames. I found that the kitchen floor had a soft spot near the window that turned out to be a section of subfloor that had gotten wet at some point. I pulled it up, let it dry out, treated the joists underneath, and replaced the whole section over 3 days. I didn't tell anyone where I was. My phone buzzed sometimes, friends mostly, wondering where I'd disappeared to, and I answered enough of them to let people know I wasn't dead, but I didn't explain. I didn't have the words for it yet. My aunt called twice. I didn't answer. By late May, the farmhouse was livable. Not finished. Not even close to finished, but livable. I had running water, a functioning kitchen, heat that worked. I'd put in enough hours that I knew every corner of that house, every place where the framing was tired, every place where my grandfather had made a decision I still didn't fully understand, which is how I noticed the workshop wall. I'd been using the workshop as my base of operations, tools out, materials staged, plans sketched on a piece of cardboard tacked to the wall. I'd been in and out of that space dozens of times before I noticed it. A section of the north interior wall that didn't make sense. The workshop was maybe 22 feet wide. The exterior measured fine. But on the inside, the north wall had a built-in shelving unit that pushed the usable interior space in that corner down to about 18 feet. 4 feet of space, completely enclosed. No door, no seam in the shelving that would suggest a panel. Just solid shelving, floor to ceiling, with my grandfather's paint cans and finishing supplies stacked neatly on every level. I stood there for a long time. Then I started moving the paint cans. It took me most of an afternoon to find it. A section of the back panel of the lowest shelf, about 2 feet wide, that had been fitted flush but wasn't glued or nailed in place. It was held by 2 small barrel bolts, the kind you'd use on a bathroom door, recessed into the edge of the frame where you'd never notice them, unless you were pressing your hands along every inch of it, looking for exactly that. Behind the panel was a space roughly the size of a large closet. It was insulated, properly insulated, with vapor barrier and everything, which was why the temperature inside was dramatically more stable than the rest of the workshop. There was a wooden shelf along the back wall, and on that shelf were 2 things. The first was a metal document box, the old fireproof kind, locked. I found the key for it on the same ring as the workshop key. I'd noticed it, but assumed it was for something else. The second was a photo album. I sat down on the workshop floor and opened the album first. It started with photos I recognized, my grandfather as a young man, the early days of the business, men I didn't know standing next to early Callaway timber trucks. Then it shifted to family photos. My father as a boy, my father as a teenager. My father and my grandfather at a job site, both of them squinting into the sun, my father with one arm around my grandfather's shoulders in that easy way he always had. Then photos of me. My grandfather must have collected them from somewhere, or had them printed himself, because I'd never sent him physical photos of anything. Me at a hockey game, maybe 15. Me at my father's grave on what I could tell from the snow was a winter anniversary. Me at what looked like a company Christmas party, laughing at something off-camera. On the last page of the album, tucked into the sleeve, was a note in his handwriting, steadier than the index card, written before the second stroke. It said, "Tom would have been proud of who you became. So am I." I'm sorry I didn't say it more. I sat on that workshop floor for a while. When I finally opened the document box, I found 3 things. A folder of financial records going back 15 years, a copy of a shareholder agreement I'd never seen before, and a letter addressed to a lawyer. Not Jeffrey, whatever, a different lawyer, a firm in North Bay, instructing that a sealed copy of the agreement be held pending certain conditions. I'm not going to pretend I understood everything in that folder immediately, because I didn't. I had to drive to the North Bay Library and sit there for an afternoon reading it, and then I had to make 3 phone calls, and only after all of that did I begin to understand what my grandfather had done. The Kinsman Road property was not an afterthought. It had been separately titled, separately assessed, and my grandfather had maintained it and paid the property taxes on it continuously since 1994, 30-plus years, specifically so that it would never appear in any Callaway Timber financial filing. It was not a company asset. It was a personal asset, and he had transferred title to me in a will amendment signed 2 years before his second stroke, witnessed and notarized, that Sylvia and Brendan had either never found or had chosen not to mention. The shareholder agreement was more complicated. The version I'd been shown when I first joined the company, the one that made it seem like my grandfather's shares passed directly to Sylvia as next of kin, had an earlier version. The earlier version specified that in the event of a triggering condition, defined in the agreement as the involuntary termination of any direct line descendant of Walter Callaway from the company, 15% of the founder's shares would revert to that descendant automatically. I had been involuntarily terminated. The North Bay lawyer, a quiet, meticulous woman named the firm partner I'd called, had the sealed copy. She had been waiting for me to call, she said. My grandfather had told her someone would, eventually. He was a very deliberate man, she said. Yes, I said. He was. The next 3 weeks were not simple. There were other lawyers involved and some firmly worded letters and a conversation with Sylvia that I will not describe in detail, except to say that her smile did not appear once during it. Brendan threatened to contest the shareholder agreement. His own lawyer apparently advised him that would be a very expensive mistake, and he backed down. In the end, I walked back into Callaway Timber with 15% of the founder's shares and a seat at the table that no one could restructure away from me. Because it was written into the founding documents of the company in language my grandfather had apparently chosen very carefully a long time ago, as if he'd always known, or at least always feared, that this moment might come. I still drive out to the Kinsman Road property on weekends sometimes. The farmhouse is finished now, properly finished, and it looks the way I imagine it looked when my grandfather first built it, before the decades and the weather got into it. The porch is solid, the roof is tight, the interior is warm. I left the workshop mostly the way I found it. The shelving is back, the paint cans are back in their places, the small barrel bolt panel is back where it was, though there's nothing behind it anymore. I kept the photo album. I kept the note. My grandfather never told me any of this in words. He wasn't that kind of man. But he had kept that property for 30 years, and he had kept that document box, and he had waited, in his careful and deliberate way, for the right moment to put a brass key in my hand. I think about that sometimes. About the fact that he trusted the truth to a locked box and a bit of time, rather than to anyone's goodwill. I think he understood something about the people in his life that he was too loyal to say out loud, but he found a way to say it anyway.